on. So what is the context? What is the kind of problem opportunity statement we're dealing with? And a lot of the data that I'm going to be showing you today is actually pulled from the Commission itself or some of our own research, if you're wondering where the data points are coming from. But this is a very interesting stat. The textiles are the fourth highest pressure point in terms of primary raw material use, water, after food, housing, transport, and fifth overall for greenhouse gas emissions. So there is, let's say, a huge environmental problem linked to textiles, but then a huge opportunity that we in the textile sector can hopefully solve together and solve with some circular and more sustainable thinking. And just another amazing stat here is that less than 1% of all textiles worldwide are currently recycled into new textiles. We could think, oh yeah, maybe some textiles is used in scraps, it's downcycled, goes to industry, but it doesn't actually go into new textile. So again, this very revealing stats here from the Commission, just really laying out the problem, but also laying out the huge opportunity for the textile, fashion sector and linked sectors if we can come up with some innovations that can really move the needle on these, I would say, interconnected issues, because circularity and carbon emissions, greenhouse gases are also very interlinked, and we want to be able to move the needle forward on that. So just laying the foundations of the policy. So why is the EU doing something on circularity in textiles, you might ask? So since the last European election in 2019, and we obviously have the new European elections coming up in June this year in 2024, but the last Commission set out the European Green Deal, which is a very ambitious strategy, essentially to transform the European economy and to decarbonize the European economy by 2050. So it's obviously hugely important. Textiles is obviously an important sector in the European economy, both onshore production, but also we can think about all the European and specifically Nordic brands who are very active players and have a global presence in textiles. There's a lot of key drivers, elements to the European Green Deal. We don't have enough time today to go through it in detail, but some that relate very clearly to textiles is mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy. And then linked to this objective, the Commission dives into more detail in a piece of policy that you might all be familiar with. So the EU Circular Economy Action Plan that came out in 2020. So this is the kind of EU flagship initiative on the circular economy. It's an update of an earlier EU policy on the circular economy, and it's very ambitious. And one of the topics, or the top 5 topics that the EU actually is diving into in circular economy, and hence the importance of the footprint, is actually textiles. So there's been a lot of focus in the Circular Economy Action Plan in updating regulation and policy, and specifically policy relating to products with the greatest potential for circularity. So, and again, I'd like to emphasize potential. So there's huge potential in circularity, but we actually need to, in textiles, but we actually need to deliver on that. Part of this policy, the Commission is emphasizing digital tools and digital traceability for textiles. I'll be talking a bit later on about digital product passport. It's probably something that a lot of the colleagues on the call are thinking about, because the Commission is set to introduce the digital product passport for textiles. But the Commission is thinking, how can some of these digital solutions actually better enable the circular economy as well? And with the Circular Economy Action Plan, there's also huge changes, implications for waste management and resource sector. And we can think in textiles, there's the upcoming potential extended producer responsibility on textiles. So that would lead to a whole new way of how we manage textiles across European society. There's also upcoming regulations on packaging. So if we're in the wider textile or textile retail sector or online omni-channel textile sales, we would need to think about the actual packaging we're using to package our textile products or to send it to our customers, because that's going to be regulated in a new, more ambitious way with the updated packaging waste regulation, so the PPWR. Now that we've set a bit of the regulatory context, the kind of foundation, I want to go into in a bit more detail about some of the other regulatory tools. So we have the European Green Deal as a kind of overarching thing. A lot of colleagues on the call might be aware of some of the specific regulations, policies coming out of the Circular Economy Action Plan. So we have a lot of emphasis in the Circular Economy Action Plan on sustainable products. And just recently, on the 23rd of April, the Commission, it went through the European Parliament, the Commission and Council's proposal for the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, the so-called ESPR, which is very ambitious and will have far-reaching changes in how we design, manufacture, also retail, and use products across the EU 27, including in textile products as well. There is also, as I mentioned at the very start of my presentation, the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, which we'll dive into in a bit more detail. But coming back to textiles and textiles consumers, another important regulation that's going to be very important for manufacturers and also textile retailers is the Green Claims Directive. So what do you say about your textile product? How do you market it? How do you use how do you substantiate some of the environmental claims that you're making about your textile product? We'll dive into that in a bit more detail later on. There's other things like the Consumer Rights Directive, also the right to repair. This might also be of relevance to textiles, and certainly I know there's a big repair movement, how to kind of commercialize that more third sector movement for the benefit of the textile sector. That's something interesting as well. And linked to the kind of claims you make about the product, there's the environmental footprinting method. So how do you actually substantiate from a scientific perspective the claims you're making about your products? And that's also coming from the Commission. Then on the other side of my screen, you see the more kind of reporting lens. So textile sector, fashion sector, like all other European sectors, now have to do compulsory reporting about their ESG performance because of the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So how will you as a sector get ready for that? It maybe seems like a risk, but it could be a huge opportunity because it means that you as a sector will get much more information from your supply chain. You'll have to collect better information from your supply chain. More information will also be available. You could think there might be better information available about how the actual content of the textile products placed on the market, the potential to recycle those textiles products, the potential to repair them as well. So whilst some of these extra reporting requirements may seem a risk, it can also be a great opportunity to inspire more circularity and more sustainability in the textile sector. Another thing I would like to focus on here very briefly before moving on is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which basically emphasizes in much greater detail what is actually going on in the supply chain. So as fashion has really global supply chains and sometimes opaque supply chains, sometimes you know what's going in your supply chain, sometimes it's difficult to find out. This actually is very exciting for those with very rigorous and well-managed supply chains, especially from a human rights, but also from a waste perspective, because the EU is asking companies to prove and also directors to certify that their supply chains are clean, that there's no upstream or downstream environmental damage or upstream or downstream human rights damage linked to your supply chain. So if you're a very ethical, sustainable, well-managed European or Nordic fashion brand, this is actually a competitive advantage compared to other brands who might not necessarily, who might, let's put this politely, who sit in a jurisdiction where this is not required of them to have such high quality human rights and environmental standards in the wider supply chain. So this can only, the CSRD can only be a good thing for the ethical, advanced and competitive European fashion brands and European fashion sector as well. Moving on, I promised a deep dive into the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. So this is obviously a very ambitious document that's come out from the Commission, some very exciting policy levers, but also exciting regulation that the Commission has come up with to really stimulate more sustainability, more circularity in the European textile sector. So it came out in 2022 and the Commission, and it's linked to the Green Deal and Circular Economy Action Plan. So the Commission is busy implementing it with policy levers, incentives, research grants, if you're into R&D research in textiles or textiles recycling, that kind of stuff, but also implementing it with some hard regulations. So overall, the strategy wants to create a greener and more competitive textile sector, which is more resilient to global shocks because we have a very globally integrated textile sector. And just an example and point of the global shocks was the COVID crisis, when we couldn't get supply back to key European markets because of supply chain disruptions. Also, more recent shocks could be Suez Canal shocks or Panama Canal shocks, which really illustrate how integrated our supply chains are, how potentially fragile the supply chains are also in the textile sector. So having more resilient supply chains in textiles can only be beneficial to European brands and also European consumers as well. Overall, and very ambitious targets here. So by 2030, the EU wants textile products placed on the EU market to have a long life and to be recyclable, free from hazardous substances, very important. And very importantly here, produced with respect for both workers' rights and the environment. And that links again back to what I was talking about, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive as well. You see the Commission is quite clever at linking different regulation, different policy packages together. And it's this new approach from the Commission of a kind of joined up approach on regulation, how to achieve some of the Commission's aim as well. It's very consumer focused. So how do consumers actually benefit from high quality but also affordable textiles? And it's really taking quite a strong position against fast fashion, so even going to the extent that saying fast fashion is out of fashion. And it's focusing on also reuse and repair services. So how do people actually get access, consumers get access to potentially secondhand clothes or reused clothes, and how do they get access and also the right information from the brands about how to repair potentially clothes as well. Another important point that I was talking about earlier is extended producer responsibility. So producers take responsibility for products right across the value chain. Also, when those products become waste, and that's the beauty of an extended producer responsibility system. So a producer pays a fee when they place a textile product on the EU market, and that fee is kept and then used to recycle that product, the textile product, when it becomes waste. So no longer is it up to the communes or the local authorities or the governments to recycle the textile waste. That cost is borne by the producer in the fee they pay when they place it on the market as well. And really to inspire a more circular textiles ecosystem. And I talked a bit about the extended producer responsibility and really to have better collection, sorting and preparation for reuse and recycling of textile waste. Because if we want proper circularity in textiles, we also need to be able to collect it correctly, sort it and treat it correctly, and also do this collection, sorting, treating, recycling at scale as well, so that it can be industrially viable. And we have some of the feedstock that we need to really boost circularity in textiles. So moving on, this is a kind of summary, some of the key points of the strategy on sustainable and circular textiles. Another point to tackle, I would say, is to try and stop overproduction and overconsumption. And also a very important point is to discourage the destruction of unsold or returned textiles. You might have seen in the news, there's often scandals when large brands, and I won't mention the brands, but large, often luxury sector brands sometimes destroy dead stock because rather than recycling or rather than gifting it because they want to maintain the brand value, they would rather destroy it. This kind of behavior will be stopped, actually regulated against in the regulation. So it might be an opportunity if you have an innovation that could help a luxury brand or a luxury fashion retailer to try and upcycle or find a better use for dead stock, then this regulation could actually encourage your innovation. So I definitely reach out to luxury retailers, brands about this, because they will be looking for solutions on how to address their dead stock. Maybe other solutions are not to overproduce in the first place of these kind of stocks, but that would be a question to look at in their supply chains. Then another important thing is this greenwashing topic. So it's going to be very important, increasingly important going forward, what claims brands and retailers make about the clothes they're placing on the market. So you might have seen there's been a lot of high-profile cases recently about some retailers making certain claims about green claims about their products, or green claims about the recycling schemes they've been running in store, which they haven't been able to back up with evidence. And now any of these, and I would just, I would just caution that any green marketing claim you make about your product, please rather don't make any claim if you don't have the right evidence base to back it up, because this will be increasingly policed and increasingly taken seriously. Moving on, just want to talk about some of the, so a lot of new EU regulation, and what is it really touching upon? So we talked a bit about marketing greenwashing, but this regulation is basically going to touch all parts of the supply chain. So there's going to be increased requirements on product design, traceability, sourcing and production. Also reporting, I talked about the CSRD and the CSDDD, increasing requirements also even on the packaging, and extended producer responsibility, both on the packaging that you place your textiles products in, and also on the extended producer responsibility on the textiles itself. So a lot of clear action and very interesting regulation coming up from the EU on this. So just want to dive into a bit more detail about some of the core topics of the sustainable and circular textiles policy and what this might actually mean. So in terms of reversing overproduction and overconsumption in the textile sector, so the Commission really emphasizes the importance of circular business models and other to help companies move away from fast fashion. And very interestingly, the Commission has defined very clearly what it means by fast fashion, and calls for an end to fast fashion. Linked to this, there's mandatory eco-design requirements. Eco-design is just, you have to consider certain environmental considerations like durability, reusability, repairability, recyclability when you're designing the product. So that's very interesting that if there are any designers on this call, not only do they have to consider normal design requirements, but they also need to factor in some environmental considerations. And some of these eco-design requirements actually become mandatory, and there's certain very interesting things like limiting certain types of chemicals, especially hazardous chemicals, that are used by the textile sector because of the potential harm to human, aquatic, and animal life as well. Also, one of the points that I talked about a bit earlier is the stopping the destruction of unsold or returned textiles. And it's very interesting how the Commission is planning to tackle this, is to have a kind of transparency obligation that would force large companies, brands, to actually publicly disclose the amount of products they discard and destroy. So not an outright ban, but a kind of naming and shaming policy at the start. And if this Commission's naming and shaming policy doesn't work, then there might be an outright ban later on. So clearly there needs to be action, and some action taken quite quickly on this topic. Then I talked a bit earlier about microplastics. So the issue of microplastics in textiles. And interestingly enough, the more that we go into recycled fibers, so we might want to take recycled PET and wove it into fashion fibers, or we might have other textiles that we recycle and use in fashion fibers, we might actually see an unintended consequence of actually creating more plastic pollution. So we need to think about this, even recycling certain plastics and weaving it into new virgin plastic thread for use in the textile sector might not necessarily be that good from an overall LCA perspective, when we account for the fact that some of this plastic might seep into the environment through microplastic when the textiles are washed. Finally, a very important topic is the digital product passport for textiles. So this is planned to come in force in 2030 across the EU. There's already lots of brands that have been thinking about it. There's also lots of innovation partners who've actually been thinking about how to create a digital product passport for textiles. It would require certain mandatory information about circularity, other environmental requirements, but also, very interestingly, for fashion players and brands, a proof of authenticity that this jumper is actually made by that brand, or this textile actually comes from wool or from another fiber. And this information would be unique to the actual jumper or the actual shirt, and it would be, the digital product passport would be shared right with different points of information right across the supply chain. So it's a major innovation, and all the fashion sector needs to really work to get ready for this, especially to be ready for the quite ambitious timeline of 2030 as well. And a final thing to touch upon is just green claims for truly sustainable textiles. So just thinking about how marketing departments, how sales departments phrase what they say about the product. It needs to be evidence-based, very clear phrasing, can be based on things like eco-labels or other specifications coming from the Commission, like PEF, OEF. But you can no longer make claims if you don't have the right evidence to back up those claims. And you also need to make very clear claims, because you need the evidence to clearly support the claims you're making. Just want to summarize, because we're almost at time, but it's been very interesting speaking with you. So I want to summarize, how can we have all this, let's say, regulation and policy? How can you, as a textile company or a player in the wider textile supply chain, how can you prepare and get ready for all this? So I just want to leave you with some points before I open up for wider Q&A session. So as the regulatory landscape evolves, now is a real opportunity for all fashion executives to rethink their business models. And how can this probably requires a holistic approach rather than targeting select parts of the value chain. So how will your business actually get ready for all these new regulations, policies, which might lead to a fundamental shift in your business model and your supply chains, if you are to be compliant with all these new policy and regulatory requirements? Then just 3 key takeaways that we'd love to give you today. So what can you do practically? So you've heard, everything we've said today, but what can you do practically to implement circularity into your business? If you think of 3 key things to take away today, please remember these points. So just try and develop an understanding of how this regulation will impact your business. When you embrace circularity, data and regulation will also support your business or support circular models. And third and finally, but also very importantly, it's better to be safe than sorry. Less is more in terms of green claims. As we've seen, please don't make marketing or sales statements that you're no longer, or you're not confident that you can back up with solid evidence. So that's the end of my presentation. Just a bit here about some of our leadership in this topic. We've also been working for the Danish government and the EU on the topic of CSRD in the textile sector, and actually gathering the information that you will need in the textile sector. It's quite complex because of the supply chains. So thank you very much for your attention. Love to hear more from you. I'll now stop sharing and I'll hand over to the colleagues from Mixi who can moderate the Q&A for us. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward, especially because thank you for the concise presentation, because there's so many aspects and topics. So it was really great to see this kind of overview, because I'm sure that you could speak about each one of the slides for an hour. And we have a few questions, so let's jump to hear them. So first, about the EPR, is there already specific legislation in place? Expected different countries seem to have their own policies under preparation.
Yes, it's a very good question. And I think the EU is, I don't know who the question is from, but anyway, it's very nice. The EU is in the process of trying to harmonize this. So some countries already have introduced their own. So those who are from France will be very familiar with the EcoTRC, the French EPR system for textiles, which was set up a long time before the Commission started thinking about EPR for textiles. So the Commission is in the process of thinking about how to set up a more standardized EPR for textiles across the EU 27. I would say, I would reflect on this. It's a bit like EPR in packaging. So the EU has allowed the member states to have their own systems or not. So Denmark is one of the few member states that doesn't actually have an EPR for packaging yet, and it will have an EPR for packaging in 2025 to comply with the EU requirements. So for a long time, Denmark has had a very high collection rate because it has had a DRS system, so a deposit recovery system for certain packaging types like bottles or aluminium cans. And this was very successful. But now the EU has decided, because not all packaging types are covered by this DRS, the EU has decided that all EU countries should have a full EPR for packaging. So I think it will be, in reflection, it will be quite similar for textiles, that there will be kind of minimum requirements set for all 27 countries on setting up an EPR for textiles across the EU 27. Hopefully that answers the question.
Rika, would you like to ask more about it?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I think it answered the, maybe it's just a very good follow-up question on that one. Like, do you see that there, because it feels that some countries have gone and implemented certain things. Like, do you think that there's a little bit of this like a piloting happening, that even the Commission is a little bit looking at, like, what will be what will be the best one to maybe to, and they kind of let it run for a while? Or what is your personal view on this?
Yes, I think on textiles and also on shoes and other products like that, I think the Commission would probably be looking at the French is one of the most successful and one of the most long-running EPR systems for textiles. And the French system is particularly interesting, exciting, because since its foundation, it's had the textile sector very involved. And I've been to some of their meetings, and the textile sector is, like the brands, will actually be sitting in these EPR meetings, discussing in detail and really coming up with solutions. And even from an innovation perspective, some of the money used by or generated by the EPR system for textiles in France is actually used for R&D. So the textile brands also get, as well as paying the EPR fees, which they have to do because of the French regulation, there is also like this R&D track to the EPR for textiles program in France, which is exciting because then they can find some potential new solutions through collaborative R&D with textile sector peers. So I think the French model would be quite an interesting one for the Commission to look at. Hopefully that answers your question, Rika.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Now, Sari, you had a question in the chat, but you also wanted to ask another one. So would you like to combine the two?
Yes, well, I'll start with my long one. It goes a bit of a side into what we've been discussing, but partially within as well. What I'm just thinking about the European Union regulation in terms of imports and of the, let's say, the fast fashion into the European Union. So has there been any consideration that what would be the impact, or what would the possibility to implement like quotas or restrictions for the fast fashion items to enter into the European Union markets in the first place?
Yes, but sorry, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's up to the Commission, as it's a common market of EU27, and as the customs and external trade competency is a competency of the European Commission, no longer a competence of the member states. So then the Commission needs to think with its circular and sustainable textile strategy. It's very clear what's going to impact the domestic market, but how will the Commission engage, or how will the Commission, obviously on a level playing field, encourage
and why I'm interested about this, sorry to interrupt, but what I'm interested in is that because there are many of these like Nordic brands as well, which have and leaning on heavily on the manufacturing in the non-European countries. So kind of the playing as a devil's advocate, that what could that mean if this kind of regulation should take place?
Yes, and I think it would be, Sari, that these non-European producers would have to live up to the full European standards. So there'll be no discrimination. So if you're saying you're making your shoes at Portugal, maybe you have a slightly higher price point than making your shoes in Bangladesh, but maybe to date you've had a slightly higher ethical or sustainability rating by making your shoes in Portugal. Then the Bangladesh producer would theoretically have to raise their ethical and environmental standards to the same level as the Portuguese producer to be able to continue to place their product on the European market. So I would see it advantageous for non-EU producers and EU producers to have a higher baseline, because basically the aim of this regulatory and policy mechanism is to set a higher baseline for the fashion sector. So it's the aim is to, raise all boats, not just to raise European companies, but raise all boats and raise the sustainability bar higher to a new minimum. I would say also, Sari, to your point, I've actually had discussions in the past with some textile manufacturers associations in countries like Turkey, as Turkey sees itself as a nearshore destination or reshoring, or a nearshore, however we want to call it, nearshore destination for some, or a lot of contract manufacturing for large fashion brands. They were very excited and interesting to see the EU circular and sustainable textiles policy, because they see themselves as a more sustainable destination, and they want to align Turkey voluntarily. The producers, at least, I can't speak for the government, but a lot of the Turkish producers want to voluntarily align themselves with the higher EU 27 sustainable and circular textile standards, because they want to focus their supply on the European market. And they also link to that, they also think that they can potentially charge extra fees, so extra couple of euro cents per piece of textile, if they have more sustainable production, and can actually show that. So it's having this more sustainable production, but also having the data to back it up. And that is also very important. I talked a bit, we didn't go into detail about reporting. I talked a bit about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. I talked a bit about the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD. But actually this data becomes very valuable to the brands for their reporting perspective, because they need to show that they're complying with some of these regulations. So they need to engage with their upstream and ask, let's say, their contract manufacturer in Bangladesh or Turkey or India, can you actually give me this data? Can you give me this data in a verifiable format? Because I need it for my external reporting, which goes to my shareholders and my board. So I need this information. I can't just approximate it anymore. It becomes, so the actual sustainability performance, but actually the data, also the data about the sustainability performance of your contract manufacturers also becomes valuable as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Sari. But
partially yes, and I know that it's kind of a tricky question, because as you mentioned as well, is that we're talking about the customs regulation as well. So it's a totally different animal as well. So but I'll just quickly summarize the earlier question, which was kind of a short one. So from this green claim perspective, so do you have any insight that what kind of requirements or information requirements is already known to come for the upcycled and repurposed or the products that has been manufactured from the upcycled or repurposed textile materials?
Yes, and I think I can't speak to the precise details, Sari, but I can say that you would have to have a kind of evidence base to prove your green claims, and you would have to link it back to some recognized methodology. So the Commission has been developing methodologies like PEFs, so Product Environmental Footprint, Organization Environmental Footprint. It would need to be linked to some methodology that could probably also be third-party verified. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but it would have to be, a solid scientific basis that could be potentially third-party verified. Because I know a lot of brands in the past have been trying to create their own eco-labels or their own mechanisms. But now this becomes difficult, because you need to link it back to some commonly agreed and more scientific approach that has a backing of an organization. There'll probably be, a kind of framework that the Commission or the Joint Research Centre, which is the scientific part of the Commission, will say, we need your standards to align with PEF OEF or a lot of the principles of PEF OEF, and then rather than creating your whole own standard as a brand, you might just say, okay, we'll just use PEF OEF, because that's going to be easier. It'll be that kind of, because right now we have hundreds and hundreds of eco labels, and it's quite incoherent, and it's also confusing to the consumer, because how do they compare a label that says better cotton to, I don't know, an LCA of a t-shirt or something? It's not comparable, right? and this is part of what the Commission wants to kind of streamline. And also for the good brands that are doing the right thing and that have all the scientific evidence basis in place, they shouldn't be worried. They've already got all this in place. They've got LCAs, they've got evidence base, and they've got data that would align with what the Commission is asking for. It's actually who should be worried are those people basically undercutting the market and selling very cheap textile products on the European market. If that's the category of brand or organization that should be worried about this. But of course, it's a lot of work for brands to get ready.
Yeah, that's for sure. But thank you. I'll let the others to ask questions
Yes,
now.
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Alison, would you like to ask your questions or would like me to read them? You have a few of them, so. Okay, I can ask them. So first, what is the EPR fee? Is there a tax on all textile-based products, apparel as well as home wares, toys, mattresses? That was yes.
It's a very good question, and we don't know yet because the EPR systems have not yet been set up. So if you were looking for a representative sample of the fee, I think it would be good to look in the French system about what is being charged already on the French market. And what is interesting in France too is that France takes an eco-modulation approach. What does eco-modulation mean? It basically means that a more recyclable or reusable product pays a lesser EPR fee. So if you make a textile and place it on the French market that is easier to recycle or potentially easy to repair or reuse, then you pay less EPR fee than if you pay a textile which everyone knows can never be recycled or reused or is difficult to recycle. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I would, number one, look through the French EPR system, and their fees should be quite transparent. So I think it's called Eco TLC, or it might have changed name. And number two, keep in mind that in the French system and probably in the future EU system, there will be eco-modulation, which basically charge different fees are levied according to the degree of repairability, recyclability, or reusability of the product placed on the market.
Yeah, and
that answers the question.
Yeah, and then there is a question specifically about the AI, how AI plays a role in this transition, which of course is an interesting topic.
Mm-hmm. What was the exact question? So
it was related to the previous question. So in the kind of the EPR, are there any AI-based solutions that?
I would say AI could be very helpful for scanning textiles, and if you've ever been to a textile sorting facility, it could help a lot with the sorting for reuse, recycling, that kind of thing. So it could play a big role there. AI could also play a big role if you have a lot of product categories, actually using some AI thinking to actually help you with your EPR compliance could play a role, because you have lots of product categories that you need to make a declaration on and think about, is it compliant? And then maybe AI could also play a big role in the textile design process and making sure that the designers are systematically thinking about eco-design when they're, as I mentioned, one of the upcoming important considerations in the circular and sustainable textiles strategy from the Commission is eco-design. So how are you actually integrating environmental considerations into future design considerations? And maybe you could have some AI tool that is constantly prompting the fashion designers, okay, should we take this textile? Maybe you could take, the AI could prompt you to say, maybe take this textile or have a 50% lower CO2 footprint. Or the AI tool could prompt the fashion designer to say, take this textile because it's more recyclable at end of life or something like that. So there's many ways that the AI could be used, you know, in the upstream, in the design process, in the actual placing on the market, the declarations. Maybe AI could also prompt the marketing and sales teams to say, are you sure you're confident making this green claim about the product, because it's not it's not based on evidence. And then AI could also be used again at the end of life to help with some of the sorting, recycling processes. And maybe a final point on AI could also help the consumer. So through the digital product passport, there'll be a way to scan the actual unique garment, and then there'll be more information. And maybe AI can help the consumer make better decisions about, you know, more efficient washing, more efficient repair, more efficient recycling, more efficient reuse or resale of garments. And the AI could kind of prompt you in a kind of digital product passport scanning tool on the consumer level. So just some considerations, but I haven't thought about this before today, but hopefully that's helpful.
Well, many ideas for new startups.
Yes.
Then there is a question about the incentives for sustainable fashion producers. So Milena is asking, regulations are good, but are not enough. Fast fashion producers already don't care, neither they will. Is there any plan to make the sustainable fashion producer more competitive with prices? So I guess, Milena, you are one of the sustainable fashion producers, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Milena wants to ask, but maybe I can, if she wants to come in as well, that's also perfectly fine, but maybe I can give some consideration. So I think with a lot of this regulation, the ideal solution is that it would move the price point up slightly. So the baseline would, of a very cheap fabric, would move up to slightly higher costs, because there's all these high costs of complying with the regulation. And ideally, if ideally people upstream in the supply chain would be paid a better wage, they should be paid at least a living wage. I think this is also some of the ideas of the regulation, this specific textiles regulation, but also if we look into the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, you know, there's human rights considerations there, and is being paid a fair minimum wage a human rights consideration? I would think it is an important human rights consideration. So as we move the minimum bar to what's acceptable to be placed on the European market, it means that the price point that the more sustainable companies like Milena's or others is closer to the minimum price point. So it's kind of dragging everyone up to a higher bar, which is closer to the price point of the more luxury or more sustainable brands that we have today, because you can no longer just dump onto the market very cheap fabric. I think this is the idea of the policy and the regulation. You should no longer be able to dump on the market very cheap textiles that don't factor in economic externalities such as waste, such as human rights issues outside the EU 27. So if we raise the minimum bar, we kind of raise the minimum price point of what is acceptable to place on the EU 27. We kind of push everyone up to this minimum level. And then because the brands like Milena's have been, or whoever's have been doing the right thing, their price point becomes more similar to the standardized price point, because these other brands have are basically forced to raise their prices to continue to play on the European market. Hopefully that makes sense. But yes.
I see you, Milena, kind of a bit skeptical. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, but it is, Milena, it is a very difficult topic, of course. And I would say that with a lot of this minimum regulation, new standards, some of the very cheap players will find it difficult to comply with this. So they will need to think, how do they actually comply with these new regulations, standards? And of course, there's regulation, but it's up to the member states themselves to enforce it. So some member states like the Nordics might take the regulation and enforcement more seriously than other member states, or France and Germany take enforcement of regulation very seriously. So there's what's actually on the books, but then there's enforcement by the member states, which also becomes important as well.
Yeah, and then we have a question about the end of life. So will there be any incentives or penalties if product goes to waste? For example, if the end of life is sooner than it should be with textiles, according to the regulation.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it comes back to some of the considerations like these mandatory eco-design considerations. So are you actually thinking in the design phase how long the product should last, how it can be recycled, reused, potentially repaired, resold at end of life? And it links back to other topics like the topic of, we talked a bit about when I was speaking about the topic of dead stock. So not overproducing, having a huge amount of dead stock that you need to dispose of. And then specifically, I I'm not entirely sure, and I don't think the Commission has made it entirely clear yet, you know, if it's going to have a longevity like a T-shirt placed on the market should last at least 5 years in a good condition or something like that. I think that would be quite difficult to regulate and supervise. But it will be, maybe it will be kind of indirectly governed through kind of waste targets for the member states. So, you know, the member states want to reduce, let's say, textile waste or increase textile waste recycling to 90%, then they need to really have measures in their country that stops a huge amount of waste being created. So how this is actually going to be transmitted is not entirely clear to me. But I think it's a very good observation from the colleague that made that.
And then there was a question about the customers. So is there going to be a circularity standard for customers to kind of determine what is really circular,
Yes.
what is good circularity in products, textile products?
I think that's an excellent consideration. What I can say right now is everyone is probably familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol that was developed 20 years ago by the World Business Council, so by a lot of the top brands, top leading companies together. Now there is another process ongoing, actually being led by Deloitte and World Business Council to create a global circularity standard. So what we created 20 years ago for greenhouse gas accounting, we want to create a common global circularity standard. So when we say circular, everyone, every company, consumer across the world actually understands what circular is, because there's no officially endorsed definition of circularity right now. Everyone can sort of determine circularity in a different way. In different markets, we determine circularity differently. Like in the US, circularity is often just a synonym for recycling, whereas in Europe, we have a much more, let's say, developed viewpoint of circularity. Also in China and Japan, there's a more developed, nuanced viewpoint of circularity. So I think it's important to create this global standard, which the World Business Council for Sustainable Development will be leading on. And in terms of consumer-facing standards, I would go back to the upcoming Green Claims Directive, that if you do have a standard, or if you do have a label, or if you do make a communication about a product that it is circular, you need to be able to back it up with an evidence base, maybe link that evidence base back to some kind of scientific standard that the Commission or a relevant regulatory body is backing, like a PEF, OEF methodology as an example. So don't just say this is a circular product without being able to kind of back it up with some kind of evidence base, which is linked to a kind of commonly agreed scientific standard, I would say. But hopefully that answers the question. And that it's definitely a very interesting topic, and it's definitely something that's being looked into right now.
Yeah.
To have this kind of common definition, terminology, standards. And I think that's very important as well for those who are doing the right thing on circularity, not to be priced out of the market by those who just claim the product is circular but have no evidence base, nothing to back up the kind of circularity credentials of the product they're claiming is circular.
Yes, and then it gives them, of course, the competitive advantage. So it's yeah, definitely important. And then there's a question about oh, Niels, would you like to ask? There was a plan to have a central European database for documentation. Do you know about the status of that?
Yes, yes. I think this, Niels, this is an interesting question. I've seen this come up for in the packaging waste regulation. There is going to be, because the Commission is now asking the member states to collect a lot of information, and they wanted to have a central database where producers would actually have to register the volumes they place on the market and register the volumes collected and recycled. So it might be that the Commission tests this first for the packaging waste regulation, and something similar, some similar database could be created potentially for textiles and textile sector once the extended producer responsibility for textiles regulation goes through the EU.
Even there was a plan to go for an EPD platform where here's my EPD, then you have an authority not only claiming this is my EPD, it's testing. And then it goes on. The only thing is somehow existing is for building, but in the States. But
Yes.
for all the other products, it's unclear. And I don't know if I make an LCA, okay, nice. I may take the software,
Yes.
but then I can publish whatever I want. So
Exactly. But Niels, I would say on the LCA, there's also commonly agreed standards on how we do the LCA and also how we communicate the LCA. And if the LCA is also third-party verified, and also we would help customers, and then we would also check what they're communicating about it. Does it actually align with the work that we've helped the customer with? And does our work align with the standards? And then sometimes even our work as Deloitte would be checked by university, because it would be then we could claim we've done a third-party LCA. So there's kind of these checks and balances, right? But I agree, it's complicated because if you're the customer, you don't necessarily understand all the nuance. You just see, okay, LCA, it must be good. But actually, has the LCA been done to the quality standard required? Has it been third-party verified? And then what is the message? Is the message that we're conveying to the customer behind the LCA actually accurate? The marketing message.
I saw that this exactly the third-party verification was one thing, and there are also some software tools who are already pre-qualified. If you do your LCA with this one, and all this was, I don't know, middle of last year, and I didn't hear anything about that at all. So it was like poof. So we must hope that people go for that, and others don't make it. The bigger smuggle in the end is faked LTAs. Do you know what we had this digital product passport? Sorry for smuggling in another question, and it's maybe also part of the next meeting. Is there upcoming standards for different product groups already, or because when we talk to customers and the producers, they're like, we will do something, and then you see a picture of the farmer, and then you have a bit of footprint and so on.
What I would say, Niels, is that so the batteries digital product passport already comes into force on 2027. So if you place a new battery on the EU 27 market, you have to meet the requirements of this. The Commission has given the task of coming up with the detailed standards to Senelec, which is the standardization body at EU level, where each member state appoints somebody or an organization, like it could be the German standards organization, or I don't know where you're based, Niels. Are you in Germany or Austria?
Yes.
Germany, yeah. So they appoint someone, and then the 27 countries agree on what the data points need to be. How is the data going to be? So that process is currently ongoing for batteries. And I would say for textiles, there will be probably a similar process. So the Commission will maybe appoint it to Senelec or another standardization body to come up with what exact data points we need. What are the standards? How is the data going to be handled? What can you as the designer see? What can the end consumer see? What can the recycler see? What can the retailer see? Because there'll be different access of data points. You won't just be able to see all the data points. If you need to see a certain set of data, you'll see it. The consumer can see something. The producer, the virgin material producer will see something, and then the recycler can see how is it best to recycle this fabric. So I think that process is ongoing, and the date for introduction of digital product passport is 2030. But actually, when you think of the complex supply chains that you need to get involved, especially in textiles, that's not actually that much time. But especially we did some recent survey work with some textiles, let's say contract manufacturers, and they were still sending information by fax to their European customers. So, moving from that level to the digital product passport is not that easy.
A frog leap. And we'll have a session about the DPP in June. So welcome to join, Niels, and welcome, of course, Edward also. We have come to the end of our hour, and there were a few more questions. So Alison, welcome to contact us, and of course also Edward if you have more questions, and also all the rest, of course. I would like to thank you, Edward, for this great hour. We discussed really so many topics, and as you mentioned, it's complicated, and we have a lot to do, all of us. So really, thank you, and I wish all of you a great evening wherever you are, and welcome to our next sessions.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Super nice.
Thank you.